Again, we want to start with practitioners, and the question for you practitioners is, before you leave this workshop and go home, and tell your city manager, yes, this was a good use of my time, what sorts of things would be helpful to you? What do you need? What are the gaps? Et cetera, those kinds of things.
I think I count as a practitioner. I work for the city of Iowa City, and this has been a wonderful educational opportunity to hear from everybody and the researchers, and it's just been really deep and wonderful thinking. But when I go back to Iowa City, we're an educated college town, and but you know, we have silos in our city government, and you know, we have, you know, all this is just such big thinking. It's just been a little overwhelming. So, you know, it's like hard enough to make people understand about climate change and what to do, and then this sustainable consumption idea, I think, is pretty nebulous within my population. And the economic piece with our economic development, right now they're not thinking sustainable consumption. They're just thinking about how to get businesses into Iowa City and not let the neighboring community give them twice as much tip and send them away. They're just interested in developing. And so I think the hardest part for me is to know what to do next and how to talk with my fellow staff members, because I don't think that even within our staff that we're thinking along these lines. And so I really have to be careful, since I'm an office of one, where to direct my energies. And I have gotten a lot of good information. But what I need is like we've talked about, a checklist, what we need to do, what has the most impact, where we can start, what we can do, and I just think we need to know where to go, what to do next. I understand the problem. I don't understand how to apply this solution in my town.
Everybody is probably there already. So we're not actually gonna, I don't think, Kelly, the idea here is not to get into a Q&A. It's to generate kind of some of these big questions from practitioners first, and then we'll have some time to follow up directly with those. So I think you had yours up next.
Dean Kubani from Santa Monica, and I had some discussions with a lot of folks over lunchtime, and based on the discussion that we had this morning, I think one thing that would be very helpful, and I've noticed that all the local government folks that are here are sustainability folks. There's no economic development, there's no housing, there's no city managers. And in order for us to be able to make any kind of significant change and really to address the systemic problem, this unsustainable economic model that we're all operating in, so that we can get to the solutions to all of these symptoms that we've been talking about, climate change and pollution and lack of well-being in our cities, we need to address that problem. And nobody, like you said, in Iowa City, nobody's even thinking about that. What could be useful, I think, is a very succinct presentation of the problem. And I thought Bill gave a very succinct presentation of it today that was really compelling. I don't know what kind of research or studies or synopses of that are available, but I think it would be great to bring some cities together with the appropriate people, the people who are doing economic development and housing in our cities, and have that discussion and then help develop that kind of alternative model to the unsustainable economy. So that's something that I'd like to explore moving forward.
Come back to you, Dave. How about on this side?
Joe, City of San Jose. We kind of talked about this before, but what I would really like is a one-page, non-jargony value proposition I could give to my boss and my city council and my boss's boss about what's the value to cities to play in this space. And we can play on any local level. We're in Sacramento a lot. I'm in Sacramento a lot. Federal level's a little, I don't have as easy a path there, but we are willing to be influential there. But just the value proposition, and it's going to come down to that bad customer word, but so I can just devote time and get others interested in devoting time. And then the wording too, I'm agree with Rosemary, a little Machiavellian about the wording. If sustainable consumption, like I said, I always think of tuberculosis every time someone says that, but if someone could come up with whatever words work, I'm fine. I don't really care about that, but those words may not be the most compelling.
That's unsustainable consumption.
I think San Antonio would love an opportunity scan. We have a variety of vehicles, venues. It's just a matter of harnessing the opportunity we have and providing that catalyst. So for San Antonio, that would be an opportunity scan.
Could you say a little bit more about that? When you say opportunity scan, what does that give you?
Looking at our assets, just like the Dr. Julian stated this morning, take a look at our assets, map our assets, what industries are emerging and what industries can emerge and evolve to be a collaborative economy.
So my thinking on this has changed over the last 48 hours. I came here knowing that we could be fairly creative and in short order to come up with a list of 78 different things that cities could do to make consumption more sustainable. And I was hoping that out of this process we would have some means to identify the top 5. Like, what are the most important things that cities could do? Because, we're all very programmatic oriented, and should we do this project or should we do that project? Now I'm thinking, what you both said, actually what everyone said here has really resonated to me. We need to be able to explain the importance of this work, and in addition, in non-jargony language, we need to be able to respond to the people who will immediately try to shut it down, because this sounds like it's bad for jobs, and we need to close the wage gap, not widen the wage gap, and we need to have a compelling, succinct, convincing way to respond to that. But what I really want, more than anything else now, is something we can do, I don't know what it is, in response to Bill's impassioned speech this morning. How do we deconstruct and reconstruct a enterprise that is sustainable and treat the root cause and not the symptoms? I don't know what that means. But it sounds like it's something we really need to figure out, and not, as opposed to figuring out whether or not we should work on car sharing or clothes sharing or accessory dwelling units.
Any other practitioners?
I just wanted to share a little bit about a couple of projects that have been going on through USDN, and as a result of the conversations here, I'm thinking we need to bring them together. So in addition to working on this workshop around sustainable consumption, there's 2 other projects that are relevant. One is this measurement project that I think many of you have heard about now. USDN funded project looking specifically at how at a community level we can measure shifts in consumption toward more sustainable patterns. So we've talked a lot about data needs and measurement and methodology. Some of that work is going on right now. So that's one project. The other one that my friend Terry Moore is working on with us is a project specifically looking at merging sustainability and economic development objectives into some kind of toolkit that local governments can use to advance both. And I think about what Dean is saying, the need to engage our economic development staff and our city management staff. And I think that tool, informed by our conversation today, might be a great way to do that. But we've got like these bits and parts that are now all coming together in my mind. They're all related. Let's make them work together better. And one last point I would make is over lunch I was chatting with Claire Seedlin, one of our community leaders. She represents NEDCO. And we were talking very strategically in Eugene how we can get the word out about this, replicate this discussion with some of these kinds of important community partners.
And it got very tactical very quickly, and I'm realizing that's what I need to do next. It's to become very tactical in my community to engage friendly partners, and they aren't just within our colleagues within the city. You know, Claire is a great example of a nonprofit that's focused on economic development and sustainability coming together. That's a very real proposition for her. That's what she's doing. But she happened to mention to me that there's a new person working for the Chamber of Commerce that is friendly to the cause. And so that, you know, that got me going. And it just makes me realize that I think for many of us that next step is a tactical one that's well informed. And so we need a little bit of both.
Yeah, so speaking of friendly partners, I just wanted to note that so what inspired me about SCORAI since this begun is that it's a research and action initiative. And so I've always really appreciated that the researchers here are deeply passionate about getting tactical and getting things done. And you can hear it. I mean, I feel it. We've been bridging research and practice within One Earth for a long time. So what I've heard is that there's, you know, like, let's support each other in getting the clear value statement. Let's support each other in getting systemic and deep at the root causes in terms of the strategies we've come up with. So I think there's a lot of cross-pollinating learning that can happen through the researchers supporting that and making that move forward. And the reason I bring this up is that we had a previous meeting in Vancouver where we did actually bring together research and practice at that time. And from that meeting, a lot of very exciting projects and partnerships emerged because of this kind of possibilities between them. And in fact, one of them, Eleni and I are involved in, Jeffrey, a number of us, has brought together kind of funders, grassroots movements, groups like Interface Carpet, Sustainable Apparel Coalition. So there's that group, which is kind of trying to come at consumption and production through a systems lens. Jason was there too. And then there's another group, which is Jeffrey was alluding to this morning, and Maurie was saying that, you know, that it was a good accident that Babe was there, but actually it was based on conversations that had happened at the North American Roundtable on Sustainable Production and Consumption. So this is the Canadian and US government, US Green Building Council, the American Business Council, coming together to try and advance consumption and production as well in a format called the North American Roundtable on Sustainable Production and Consumption. It's also linked to the United Nations Environment Program. For some of you, that's a useful link. For other people, that's a link you want to avoid. I understand that. But for some of you, it's a useful link. And we had talked the year before about what are the kind of places we can move sustainable consumption and production forward, and cities came up. And I knew of Babe's work and the work of the USDN. She came, met Maurie and Philip, just as you described, and out of that sparked this meeting. So I think the same thing I could imagine that, I just want to say in terms of friendly allies, there's within your city, but there's all these groups trying to make sense of this field in a clear way. And I just want to offer that, you know, I'd like to walk that journey together to get to that clarity quick, like within the next half year, so that we can really advance this forward from all these different perspectives. So potentially one project that could come out of this, to be very concrete, was to see what ways of talking about this have worked in different contexts, and maybe to start looking at this framing that really supports it, and how best to kind of, what kinds of slides can we develop that tell the story, how do we get at that systems thing. So maybe a kind of like framing project could be something that we could get going from here.
So,
Okay, we want to give our researchers time, but
right, that too, and we want to come back to practitioners. We had an earlier request. We want to hear from researchers and others. What's already underway? We've started to get at some of that, and also and then we'll start to address some of these questions. Tom Bowerman has something he earlier asked to share that has to do with, here's some stuff we've already got that may help some of you, and then we'll come back to other hands.
Well, thanks. I do have some material now about the whether I'm a practitioner or a what's the other choice, researcher. When I was in the very first SCORAI conference that I attended, it was academic or practitioner. That was much easier because I always think of myself as both a practitioner and a researcher. So
You're a academic.
Academic. Is that what it is? But that sounds awful like a lot like academic, though. So practitioner would be right. Okay. So when I was in the cafe circles yesterday, what came across was a lot of call for research in areas that we have already undertaken. And what I wanted to offer is that we are a resource for you to use and to make our work available to you, not because it's necessarily the right answers, but we certainly tried hard to come at a lot of these questions in a very rigorous way. And across the last 6 or 7 years, we've covered a lot of territory on the sustainability questions. And those also run into veins such as the sharing economy, where we run a collaborative survey with Center for New American Dream, for example. And such things as quality of place, where we've done 5 very rapid back-to-back studies with a researcher at the University of San Francisco, where we're testing both the physical and the social quality of place as a benchline measure. And I heard that said earlier about the possibility of obtaining a measurement of the assets that we have. And that's what we're really trying to come at with. And the base of this really is that the way we do our work is trying to understand what your constituency, all of our constituency is, what they're hungry for, what they desire, where their values are, driving towards values, and putting into these measurements these concepts that we have on the table here. And our research is really fundamentally based, very fundamentally based. It's a baseline, is we're trying to find where we have permission, where the public gives us permission by virtue of the fact that they're identifying this is important to them, not necessarily on the physical solution or the activity per se, but the underlying value that's beneath it. So we use the value, then we connect it to the actions, and then we test. And one that I've heard quite a bit about with carbon tax, for example, we've been testing that for 6 years, and we are not out of the woods there with the public. But there's a lot of things that we are out of the woods with the public that are being implemented in these communities, especially in Eugene, because part of the process that we did, and this is where I'm getting to my handout, is that we collaborated with 3 other researchers, teams, on a very low-budget process of three surveys. The first one was a statistical sample survey, then it was focus groups, and then back to a opt-in internet survey. And this is what I'm going to hand out, not as necessarily the answers, but it gives an idea of a procedure and a process where we're working with the city. We've heard the conversation that the jurisdictions have this power of conducting the conversation, of instilling being the venue for the conversation in multiple arenas. And that multiple arena part is you kind of have to pick your arena appropriately, but this is a part of it, is to engage people who you usually don't have show up in the meeting. So we're doing random sampling, outreaching to people who are usually not engaged in a high enough number count that it begins to take a statistical relevance and asking questions that we usually don't find asked. And I heard that somewhere in the conversation earlier today, is people are hungry to engage these things. And we know this even from our own research, where many times we'll close a survey out that we've asked really kind of hard, touchy feelings about economics and what the things like the qualities of measurement that we're aiming towards, but even though we're still measuring fundamentally in GDP. And we ask these things, and when we close the survey and we say, is there anything else you'd like to add about the survey that you've just taken? And we get about 35 to 40% of open-ended comments on that. And about 85% of those open-ended comments go along the lines something like, those were really hard questions, and they're exactly the types of questions we should be asking ourselves. And thank you very much. And that's a process then that we're trying to aspire to continually do that. And so what I'm going to hand out is one example, one study that we did with other collaborators, which is also our goal, and it gives the link to our home webpage, where we store a lot of open-sourced results and reports. We do not post raw data, but to qualified researchers, we make that available. And the only thing we additionally ask is that you critique our work, give us feedback, and when you use it going forward or you do your own things, please try to keep us abreast of what you're doing too. So, thanks.
Great, that's a great resource. I know David has something, but I'm gonna be.
It's a follow-up.
It's a follow-up with that?
Follow-up,
Okay.
one finger.
Okay,
Right.
one finger.
So just a quick follow-up. Yeah, right. There's so much great research that SCORAI members have done that when we stop to read it is very helpful. The problem is we rarely have the time, practitioners rarely have the time to read it, and in fact, we don't even know it exists because we don't read the journals that you publish in. We don't read journals because we don't have time to read journals. So what we need from SCORAI is, really we don't, is we need some way by which every time you publish research that you think may be relevant to us, you find a way to get to us, and we need a mechanism for this to happen, a 3-sentence summary of why the research is relevant. You don't even have to tell us the results. Why is it relevant? And maybe a few results. And if you want more information, click on this link and go read the abstract. You're doing great work that is just, we never even know about.
So any other practitioners have something burning they want to throw in the mix? And then let's kind of open that conversation up and see how the researchers want to respond to that. I want to look over here because I've been on this side of the room. So we'll start here.
Well, I just wanted to say that it's been a learning experience on the other side of the aisle as well, just to see how various ideas were received, what kind of comments they elicited, what sorts of things you come to us saying this would be helpful. So I just want to second what David just said, that from our perspective, we don't know what people don't know. We don't know what people would like to know. So I think one of the things going forward that would be helpful is talking about how we can get that back and forth traffic to be more regular. One of the things that struck me the most was we heard the impassioned comments that Bill made. Then we went to the fishbowl, and we heard this problem. You know, what about the people whose incomes we feel we want to raise? And that didn't really get addressed that I heard. You know, it was articulated, it was a heartfelt concern, and it was like a big stone in the road, you know? People kind of drove off the road, around it, back on, but it didn't get moved. And there are a lot of different ways to move it. I mean, the whole notion of prosperity, what it is, what actually makes people feel better, what gives them a sense of a good life, is highly contested terrain. It's not just material possessions or money. So you can argue that rich people have a problem of scarcity. The scarcity is in time. So you can organize the discussion of prosperity in such a way that that problem isn't the stone in the road. But to do that, you know, people who know that literature have to be able to draw on that literature and present it. But if I hadn't been here and I hadn't heard that impassioned plea and then that stone in the road, I wouldn't know that you needed that discussion. So I would never have thought to bring it up. So I just suggest that this is the beginning of a dialogue, and perhaps one of the things we need to do is to find an effective way of continuing the dialogue.
So researchers, let's kind of hear some of your responses. All right. We're going to mix it up. And it's fair game for anybody, but we really do want to hear, you've all been sitting there listening to practitioners, whatever. What are your reflections? What's coming up for you, and how could you help them when they're going back to community?
Sorry, I'm a practitioner. I'm going to insert one more really quick thing, but I guess similarly, you're talking about economic development folks not being here at the table. I think very quickly as we're defining this, I'm really hearing Julian's message that we can't retrofit justice and that we need equity folks at the table very quickly on this conversation if we're going to define it well. And that needs to be a very early next step in this process as well.
Start here.
I fear that I'm a practitioner, so I should probably defer to some academics first.
I have to admit, I don't know everybody well enough to know who's practitioner or who's academic.
Academic to me, I didn't say academics, it's to me academic sometimes has a pejorative nature.
A couple of comments. One is, you said Julian's comments about not retrofitting equity. I understand that argument, but as a researcher, I want to know what the evidence is on that, and there isn't any. So right away, I want to do some research to figure out, is that true? I can think of examples where I think retrofitting worked. So, but it's anecdotal, and I'm not real convinced by it, just by anecdotal evidence. So more broadly, what I hear is two messages. One is the easier message is there's a lot of knowledge out there produced mainly by researchers and people doing case studies and so on, but there's not a lot of dissemination of that knowledge. We need to work much more diligently to make sure that what we think we know is shared pretty broadly. If you want a list of 78 things that cities have done, they're out there. So and there's no reason why it shouldn't be made more readily available. The tougher question is, what is it that makes any one of those 78 things something that would be useful for you to know? And what I mean by that is, I talk to a lot of people working in cities, and the first thing they ask me is, can you tell me some best practices? And I can do that. I'll say, well, Seattle does so-and-so. And their reaction is always, oh, God, we're not Seattle. We can't do that. Right? You say the whole time, of course. Everybody says that. If I use San Francisco as an example, I mean, forget it. It works in California, So, the real challenge for research is to try to figure out exactly what is it that makes something relevant to individual places, and we don't know how to do that. We're working on that. The third thing is, just very quickly, we have to really understand where new research has to be done. Where should researchers be putting their energy toward questions where we really don't have any answers, where we know we don't have any answers.
Thank you, Ken. I've been thinking about this from the perspective of working groups in this afternoon and beyond this afternoon. So I totally agree with Kent that we need a better mechanism of understanding the research needs and the research questions and connect them with the answers that we know and to connect that to the research that we need. So I thought that Vanessa's idea of a framing working group is great. That's one idea that I would like to promote. The other idea that I think Tom and I have been exploratory talking about is the idea of something like a clearinghouse. Well, not just a database of what we know, but more like a mechanism. It can be web-based, it can be supported by volunteers to understand the issues that are out there, and also to connect them with the research that has already been done. So that's the second idea. The third idea basically came up yesterday with Judy in the group, but resonating here also. We really need some in-depth very good case study research. Not just the examples, okay, Seattle or San Francisco have been successful. What exactly made it so successful? So part of it is unique in the city, but still you can do retrospective research, find out, was it the mayor, was it a group of activists, was it just an economic opportunity, was it a crisis, right? Or was it all of the above? So can we understand more in depth? And that also brings me about the local city-university connection. It's not here. I don't know how many researchers from the University of Oregon are here in this room. Exactly. So having a research project here in Oregon with BAPE and the city people, together with researchers of the University of Oregon, to understand why Oregon or Portland has been so successful, and do an in-depth understanding of that, and then follow up with the gaps and the prospects. And then we have some raw materials to start comparative analysis, right? How can we compare different examples of research? Just very quickly, a few ideas of other ideas for working groups. One is about carbon tax that came up. You know, can cities actually impose a carbon tax? And not just a carbon tax. If you impose a carbon tax, you get a great inequality problem. So how do you address it? So the whole issue around, can we create an example, a working example of a local carbon tax? And then the question of that came up this morning about working hours, disposable income, etc., etc. I would like to see I would actually like to participate in a working group that would look in reducing disposable income increase in combination with more security in terms of access to food, access to affordable housing, access to the services that one needs. So more security and access and less disposable income increase that are going to be spent on unsustainable consumption. I have a couple of more ideas, but I will save them now.
We'll just keep going. This idea of the communicating, telling the story, how do you get it across? What words do you use to talk about sustainable consumption? Maybe you find other words and everything. This was one of the kind of high priority questions and issues that was in this roundtable that Vanessa and I were talking about over these last 2 years. Folks in the federal government who were advocates of sustainable consumption were all saying, we don't know how to talk about this within the government. This is not established as a priority. How do we move this stuff forward? And so the idea of a working group on communicating, framing, a number of us have been talking about this the last 2 years, about how to do it, how to approach it. The thing is that there's not going to be one brochure or paper that's going to tell the story. I mean, we talked about that. Oh, I need a one-pager or a three-pager to bring to my boss or bring here and there. The thing is that there's all these different audiences. There's this whole diversity. It's complex. And as anybody working in market research or communications research knows, that if you're going to communicate, you have to be clear about who your audience is, and you have to be able to frame or the message and find the right kind of vehicle that's going to resonate with them. And sometimes and maybe it isn't going to be you that's going to communicate. It's going to be somebody else that they know that's familiar, and you, the outsider, just isn't going to get through. So there's all these different kinds of strategies. There's all these different types of communication research that has all this knowledge about doing it and experience everything. But in our particular case, I think we do need to have like this one pager or something for us, where we can communicate with each other. But we need some mechanisms to identify exactly our own needs in terms of the kinds of audiences that we're all trying to reach. Like if this working group is going to have a real practical work agenda as to what kind of knowledge and all is out there that can bring in to solve this, we need to have some mechanisms for having that input into the working group so that you can identify, you can clarify to the group exactly what it is you need to say and who it is. And then kind of work with them on that so that there's so it goes back and forth. So it's a knowledge exchange, not just a kind of a one-way, let's find the literature on this.
Right, I'll be the fourth old guy with white hair. To speak so I guess I have a question for the moderator. I actually do have a specific proposal for a working group.
Yeah, I
So,
think
so
what
should I
we-
put that on the line now?
Yeah, I think that's okay. I think Kelly's trying to hear what she's hearing is potential working groups, so yes.
Okay, so I thought that the roundtable discussion, or whatever that was called. Yeah, the fishbowl, I thought that was terrific. And what I came away from that is that there are 3 topics that appear to people on the front lines to be really important and workable. And those had to do with wages, waste, and housing. So the rest I will put forward in the frame of housing, although you could substitute the other ones too. Wages, right. Wages, waste, and housing. And I'll put it in terms of housing because it's a topic I know more about. So one, I really am skeptical in the end that there is a dichotomy between short-term and long-term research. Just as I'm very skeptical that there's a substantive dichotomy between action and research. In other words, if you act without research, you act thoughtlessly. If you research without action, you don't learn anything. You just stay within the words. So my premise is that both of those things necessarily go together. And second, like our colleague Doug Holt, he uses the term macro, meso, micro a lot, and there's a lot of literature out there. And I think that, quite honestly, the reason that I'm here is because this relationship between practitioners from cities and from researchers, I think, provides an opportunity to get at that issue. So what I mean, that's very important because from this meso level, you can appreciate and understand the global macro structures that are out there that Bill spoke so eloquently about. But you then also have access to and can influence the micro forms of action that need to be taken. Right, so the meso level, I think, is a kind of privileged place where scholars and activists can meet together. With that in mind, I'm going to propose a working group that would be a coalition of 3 sponsoring organizations. That might be USDN, SCORAI, and perhaps the New Economy Framework. 3 housing funders, which will go unnamed for the moment. 3 cities, 3 universities, and 3 grassroots groups from the particular cities that are selected or volunteer. In other words, each of those are a kind of triangulation of 3 different ways of understanding the housing problem in those places. And so the purpose of this, these triangulated groups would be to conduct cyclical action research, meaning that real things would get built and evaluated in a post-occupancy evaluation fashion. So secular action research about what I'll call small housing as units of production as well as units of consumption. And that to determine how ecological, social, and technological change is linked. I realize that that's a lot, but I'd be happy to write it out. But so that's a place to start a discussion.
Oh, he did. I'm kind of coming around.
I'd like to build, because I'm not an old guy with white hair. They could figure it through to my head. So, yeah. So I'd like to build a bit on what Stephen said, but from my angle. It's about how we live and where we live it makes a huge difference in our consumption because of the size of the house, how it's where it's located, density, and so on. But it also makes a big difference in our sense of well-being. We can be isolated, we can be close to other people, it can be community or not. So I think understanding better the connection between a house and well-being is really something that I'm very interested in. So I would like to do something with your proposed group to essentially explore the question of how can we lead a shift towards smaller houses and denser houses while increasing well-being at the same time. And I say it with a full understanding of, who said it to me yesterday about Portland, that two words are hated the most important.
Sprawl and density.
Sprawl and density. So I am fully aware of the reactions people have to density and so on. And small spaces. So that's why I find it such an interesting question. To figure out the housing question in connection with well-being.
Coming around.
This is definitely a practitioner comment, but it has to do with framing research agendas. And I come to this meeting, as I think many of you know, understanding sustainable consumption not as something that that is in any way going to mean that I have to think about how individual consumers behave. I'm leaving that aside and assuming that there's a huge leverage point that has nothing to do with individual consumer behavior, but has to do with how large institutions purchase and the nature of that economic signal in the economy. Cities being an important category of large organizations that consume, that purchase, that send that economic signal. And so we have a research agenda around that, which is a component of sustainable consumption that has nothing to do with individual consumer behavior change. I hope that, and so I'm partly assessing, is this group only about individual consumer behavior change? If so, there's very little connection between what I do and what this group will do. However, if this group is interested in other ways to address large-scale consumption, inclusive of strategies like changing the purchasing practices of large organizations, then I'm interested. And we already have work ongoing that includes research agendas. That is, we already have academic teams working on components of the research. But I wanted to mark a kind of homology between the needs that we hear from city purchasing professionals about what they need. And because it might give some clues, for instance, around a research agenda like this. One is they say they want a list of easy things to do. The other is that they want an argument for the business case that they can give to their city. And our response has matched, to a certain extent, what I've heard verbally a little bit here, which is we cannot give them that list of easy things to do. What we can give them is a template for process, which includes forming a multidisciplinary team within their city that focuses on the question of sustainable purchasing and uses a set of principles, what you might call a framing document in the language of this group, that says this is what you should be looking for in whatever purchasing policy you create. We're not going to give you the list, we're going to give you the how to make the policy and the values that should be embedded in the policy, but you're going to have to do the work yourself as a city to figure out what your policy should be given your political reality, your geographic location, your community appetite, the various things that are available to you. That's one thing. The second thing is, within that then, we will develop guidance on specific purchasing categories. And I've talked to a couple of you about research needs we have within specific purchasing categories. For instance, I was just talking to David about the fact that there's a tendency to want to use specific attributes like bio-based or recycled or recyclable as proxies for environmentally beneficial. David anecdotally suggested over lunch that his informal research on this topic suggests that using attributes like that is basically like rolling the dice about whether you're actually going to get environmental benefit, except in very specific cases. So we are looking, what we need in order to create guidance on a per category basis for purchasing is substantiated evidence of connections between such attributes and genuine environmental or social benefit, or the absence of those connections, either way, because politically there are some very powerful forces. For example, for bio-based, we have the soybean board as one of our members. They will advocate very strongly for bio-based being a proxy for environmental benefit. We would need the research. We will ask them, what is your evidence that this is environmentally preferable? But they have the deep pockets for that research to show it in some way. But it would be very helpful for us to find research that could counter that. So there's kind of multiple levels of research for us that might, some of what I've shared with you hopefully might help you in thinking about, on the individual consumer side, for those of you who are interested in that, what are the corollaries? What group structures and how do you bring people together in ways that might support research agendas?
And Mike, as you come around, then you've got a couple people behind you as well. And then let's visit the chart and see how it's leading.
Okay, so I have a one-finger comment for Peter Vergragt comments. So thank you. So just as we're defining what we want to study, I think we really need to pay attention to what the practitioners have said they needed some help with. So I just want to make sure that what gets on the agenda, and I just want to offer this out as roundtable ideas if anybody's interested, I would be willing to sit at any one of these tables. One is, what is the quick menu of the top action items that need to be addressed right now? So that was City of Iowa. Happy to sit with you and anybody interested in that. That's that menu. I just need a menu right now. The other one is the memo that Dean was talking about and others were talking about. Like, what is a one-page, two-page thing that we can concretize or do, and even an outline? What needs to be on this right now? And like, let's use our time productively so we come out of here with some outcomes. That's the practitioner, academic transition person that I am. Right? It's like, I just feel like this real compelling need to get some hard stuff out of here that you can walk away with. And the third one is, David made a comment about the greenhouse gas emission inventory of consumption, and where's the distinction between looking at the services in the domestic market and then the actual import of services from abroad, and how are we bringing that into a greenhouse gas emission inventory of consumption, or whatever the EPA has done. You made a comment around that. So I think that there's a lot of momentum that could be leveraged. I don't know what's going on. I'd like to learn more about it, but we're certainly in Canada not moving towards consumption-based emission inventories, and I'd like to connect with people who are doing that work and try and move that forward as well. Any one of those three. Thank you.
Somebody who hasn't had an opportunity
Just briefly going to follow up on the last comment and connect to some of the things that David's been talking about over the last day and a half or so. I think we've missed an opportunity to think about a potentially powerful conceptual notion for drawing together sustainable consumption in the context of cities. And that's the concept of thinking about cities as an organic metabolism. That cities and other regional units, they take in materials on a daily and weekly and annual basis, and they assimilate those materials and process them and then dispel them as waste products. The technique that David's work on consumption-based greenhouse gas inventories is based on something called environmental input-output analysis, which sort of falls within the field of industrial ecology or urban ecological systems analysis. But there are other tools that are sort of in that space, and one of them is the tool of measuring metabolic flows within cities, or material flow analysis. Now this is something that EPA had demonstrated some interest in probably about 12 or 15 years ago, when EPA had more interest in the sort of larger field of industrial ecology. From my vantage point, that interest has largely ebbed away. But there may be an opportunity, and I would be glad to have a sort of conversation with anybody here who might be interested in potentially submitting their city as a pilot case for doing a material flow analysis, which would provide a baseline on a whole array of indicators that could be used then as the background for assessing the success or lack of success of any interventions that may come about in future years. So this is a tool that's been used quite extensively in Europe. European cities have embedded it within their sustainable consumption plans, and it may be something that resonates here as well.
So time for 2, maybe 3 comments from folks we haven't heard from, and then we want to save the time to get into this. Let's get time to roll up our sleeves and go away with some practical things by clarifying what we've heard for work groups and then giving you some time to actually work together. So I'm going to go over here. I won't forget on this side. Who hasn't had an opportunity to say anything in this round who'd like to?
I just want to piggyback on what Jason said, because Jason's working with the Sustainable Leadership, Purchasing Leadership Council, which is working with both private entities and government on looking at these high impact categories of purchasing and developing some tools. And I work with the EPA Forum on climate and materials management, and we're doing the same, it's very similar work, and we're coordinating, but we're focused specifically on government and higher ed institutions. And I think this work is really critical for cities and other government sectors in terms of the opportunity for government to drive through their purchasing decisions how products are produced and delivered. And so we're looking at categories like fuel and building materials and food and IT equipment and carpet. And just one example in the area of fuel, we're looking at diesel emissions from the transporting of goods and diesel emissions used at construction and maintenance and renovation sites. And those, those are huge public health impacts for cities, where you've got a lot of low-income people often living in those, along those highways that transport a lot of goods, or in those areas where there's a lot of development going on, road repair, et cetera. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. And we've got information up on the EPA Forum website about what we're doing, and we're in the process of developing a toolkit that should be available sometime in 2015. And so I just want people to know about that.
Yeah, and I'd just add to maybe an idea for a committee or a working group, right? And all this great research that's being done, and I know that there's people are looking at like what has the most impact, but I wonder if anyone's done like a key driver analysis for a city, and what gives me this idea is that what an incredible stakeholder group here, diverse and well-informed practitioners and researchers. You could add more diversity to that. And when you do a key driver analysis, that you're kind of polling, and that's a kind of process that you do. And the end of it, what you have is what a network of factors, how they're connected, which ones are the ones to focus on, and what order to follow to have success. So I think maybe that's something that could be done here in Eugene. It'd be great to start maybe with one city. I don't know, it's just an idea. I'd be interested in participating in something like that.
Anybody else over here we haven't heard from? Okay, I'm coming to you next.
I just want to share an idea for a working group based on a conversation that I've had with a few folks, and that was to consider sort of how you might frame up a pilot project or research to explore how to scale up the role of local government and sort of neighborhood level sort of sharing efforts, so the reuse and repair and that sort of thing, and what that might look like in different contexts. I mean, how that might roll out in Portland, for example, which has already begun, might be very different from how it might roll out in San Antonio and how it might roll out in Vancouver and other places. So I just want to say that there need some folks kind of chatting about that. It's a very sort of practical working group, but maybe there's some folks interested in that.
I missed a key part of that, so tell me again. I know that it's, kind of accommodate or recognize, acknowledge differences among cities, but the working group is focused on what again?
So what is, how to sort of consider the role of local governments in catalyzing and supporting and sort of scaling up, if you like, neighborhood level sharing efforts.
Okay.
So these are the tool sheds and the swaps and the fix-it repair workshops. What is the role of local government in doing this? I mean, we do have one example here of Portland that's taken a particular role. Is that, is that the role that local government should do? Can they go beyond that? And how do they do that? And how do they consider a context? Both contexts. I mean, if you're a local government where you're able to talk freely and openly about sustainability, and that's the framing and the language that works, it's very different from another place where it's really might be fundamentally more sort of economic development driven. And then it varies from neighborhood to neighborhood. Even in Vancouver, how you talk about something like that in a neighborhood that's very wealthy and might be have a certain ethnocultural mix will be very different from another neighborhood that has a different ethnocultural mix and a different socioeconomic makeup.
Thank you. Just a quick response to Maurie's comment. Ecological footprint analysis is a form of material flows analysis, and we do it for cities. And the last paper on the reading list is called Getting to One Planet Living, and it's basically a study Jennie did rather for her PhD, which we wrote up for the State of the World report in 2013. Just a couple of points to put down here. What we show with eco-footprint analysis is not just the material flows in and out of a city, but the area of ecosystem required to produce those flows and to assimilate carbon wastes, for example. And when you do that, you're identifying the real city. What we think of as a city is just a node of consumption. The productive area is everywhere else that you're importing your stuff from and dumping your wastes into, just as Stephen said. And here's the scary bit. For a typical North American city, that extra urban area is 200 to 500 times larger than what you think of as the city itself. Now, if you start to think about cities as systems, that's the city. It's 500 times bigger in many cases than the area you're used to thinking of. But because, again, we've constructed our notion of cities in the absence of this systemic connectivity that we've created through our consumer society, we've completely lost track of the fact that the area that is supporting our cities is vulnerable to climate change, it's vulnerable to energy shortages, it's vulnerable to geopolitical disruptions, and so on and so forth. I once wrote a paper called Cities Are the Most Vulnerable Structure Ever Invented by Humans, for just these reasons. So my question for this table would be, if we're going to start rethinking what we ought to be doing as cities, what are the implications for urban planning of simple recognition that in an era of dynamic change, of climate and so on and so forth, of being utterly dependent on elsewhere for everything? And then you start to rethink the whole idea of city as a regional system, a bioregion even, which is, draws on its immediate environs and has some, governance over the nature of those agricultural and forest ecosystems and so on and so forth. See, we really are here. We want to survive engaged in the process of redefining the nature of our nature with the rest of reality. If we don't do it, then the rest is academic. That's a real, I think, interesting question for practitioners to bring home. We've got 130 other things to say.
You described it as being succinct before.
I just want to follow up on that to note that there is, to link that back to messaging, the notion of risk and resiliency, cities as resilient in the face of abrupt climate change or markets dropping out, that there is actually some research on messaging around that seems to resonate much more for people when thinking about displaced risk. And the disruption of those chains than any other sort of messaging around your life will be happier, the typical messages that we tend to hear. So there's some potential there to start elucidating those
chains, not only for individual consumers, but also for rationalizing policy at higher levels. So.
Okay, I think. Okay.
And I can give references. Actually, one of them
I think we need to be quite careful in embracing this sort of conceptual category of resilience. Because in a political context, resilience typically means how do we keep on doing what we're doing and protect ourselves more assuredly from the hurricane sweeping us out to sea.
How about adaptive capacity?
Yes, I mean, just to extend the point, I happen to live in sort of ground zero where this debate is taking place, and in the wake of Hurricane or Superstorm Sandy in the New York metropolitan area, sustainability has largely fallen out of the political lexicon, and resilience has been inserted as the more politically appropriate way of talking about how do we build, hardened systems along coastal communities, in order to allow populations living on barrier islands to be able to withstand the next hurricane.
Restore the shore.
I'm right there with you.
Jersey strong.
So anybody who hasn't had a chance to say anything, who has what they think is a nugget of an idea for what we're heading towards are working groups. Anybody who hasn't had a chance to throw in something in the mix? Okay. Is this a follow-up comment?
Follow-up.
Okay. So this is a last comment, and then what we're going to try to do is go through Kelly's list and see what seems like a work group, what's just kind of a concept, an idea. We'll see where we go from there.
So, among federal agencies, the Department of Defense is widely respected for having one of the most robust sustainability strategies of any federal agency, in part because they frame it in terms of exactly the supply chain risk. I mean, the reason they've done it is because of that supply chain risk. And so it's not just at the city level, but it has political power, and I concede the point about the strategic or tactical risks of using a language of resilience or risk in place of sustainability, and yet politically there is tremendous power in doing so.
So Ashley Zanoli, I co-lead the West Coast Climate Forum with Shannon, and another product we've developed is a community food waste prevention toolkit called Food Too Good to Waste. We've tested it with over 18 different cities and states and seen about a 25% reduction in food waste at the household level, so it is getting at consumption. We're also working right now to develop a really granular baseline with other researchers from around the world, and we need help. So there's a national ad campaign that the NRDC will launch next summer with the Ad Council that could provide a really nice umbrella of about 90 million in leveraged assets. So I thought I should bring it up.
Just one comment that's...
Okay, we're not going to get to the working group, so we keep going on these, but this has got to be really brief.
I feel like Stephen mentioned a couple of false dichotomies, and I just want to add one to the list, which is the conversation that pops up periodically, and probably will in the working groups too, which has to do with individual behavior change or institutional, or maybe institutional/cultural behavior change. And I always perceive this as being dangerous to silo. And I think it really works both ways. And if you look at the civil rights movement that came through, and there were actually people, individuals, that took behavior stances, and it moved the needle in such a way that the culture change began to occur. So it seems like I'm getting buy-in, because you were the one that said that you're not interested, individual change, that's not what you're interested in.
That's not what our work is. Overall, I think as a movement it's required,
okay.
But our focus is not there.
Well, then let me add that it's my estimation that you should be thinking about it from an individual basis, because, so here I am associated with the University of Oregon on a fairly distant relationship, but I'm a guest researcher there, but it gives me the opportunity to do a lot of interviewing with academics. And we have academics that commute from Portland to teach at the University of Oregon. And that's like 600 or 700 miles of commuting a week. And we have philosophy professors who fly to Reykjavik for the grand opening of an ice museum. And so it's physical science opening for a moral education. And I submit that the people, or well, you might say the pedagogy of learning is that we learn more by watching and observing other people than having a professor stand in the front of the room. So I throw down the gauntlet of this group to not displace individual responsibility of ourselves simultaneously, and to request substantial amount of internalized responsibility taking for who we are, so that we demonstrate to the people that we're trying to cultivate the idea of sustainability, so that we don't just shuck that off and say it only happens through social change. I'm not going to be held responsible for this. So that's my plea and my position internally, and I hope we kind of like, as we break camp at this, that we kind of carry that part, at least at minimum, to think very seriously about our own carbon footprint and our sustainability responsibility.
Something we all have to watch.
Yes.
and then the attitude behavior divide. So it's not just watching, it's actually making that connection, which I know you're very familiar with talking about.
So let me run through the notes.